Hey, Simon. Hey, everyone. Soren Kierkegaard is considered the first existentialist philosopher. But who was he? How did he use literature to revolutionize philosophy and become the father of existentialism? And why did he say that freedom causes anxiety? And what was his answer to the existential angst? So today I'll answer all these questions that I discussed Kierkegaard's life and his journey of becoming a philosopher and a writer. In the next segment, I'll summarize and discuss his most famous philosophical books, Either Or and Fear and Trembling. So get yourself a cup of tea and some Danish pastry, gather your Lego pieces, or just put on your Viking hat or whatever Danish cliche you have, because we're talking about existentialism of to be or not to be, that famous line by the Danish prince Hamlet. Soren Kierkegaard was born in 1813 into a wealthy Danish family in Copenhagen. While his mother came from a modest background, his father was a wool merchant and traded to keep the Danes warm in the cold winter. But on the inside, he was a stern Nordic man with an interest in rational philosophy and intellectual activities. As a young boy, Kierkegaard was exposed to works by Scandinavian, German, and ancient Greek philosophers, including Plato and Socrates. Despite his exposure to philosophy, he was not interested in becoming a philosopher himself. Instead, he went to the University of Copenhagen to study theology, and who knows, perhaps to become a clergy or a theologian. After all, his name Kierkegaard literally means churchyard in Danish. But despite his religious belief in God, he was deeply lost at times, and as a result, he was more drawn to literature. In fact, he wrote his MA thesis on Socratic irony through the works of Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. What is Socratic irony? It simply refers to the father of Greek philosophy, Mr. Socrates, who was pretending to be ignorant, stupid, or naive in order to confuse his opponents so that they let their guards down in a debate. It's like a detective who plays a fool for the defendant to reveal something by themselves. So Kierkegaard's philosophy was heavily influenced by his ironic method that we know less than we think, as he utilized naive characters in his writing to shell out some basic ideas. In 1837, when he was 24, one of the most famous events in philosophy took place. This single decision became the most important decision in Kierkegaard's philosophical writings for the rest of his life. What was it? He met a woman. Yes, it's a boy meets girl story, but immensely transformative in the philosophy of existentialism. Kierkegaard met and fell in love with Regine Olsen. Then he met her family. 4 months later, he proposed marriage. She said yes. Everyone in Denmark celebrated and expected a beautiful Nordic wedding. But a year later, he broke up with her. Why? It's complicated. The same line every single woman uses today to describe their relationship. But in Kierkegaard's case, he had an answer. He was too melancholic, therefore unsuitable for marriage. But the real reason remains unknown, but it doesn't take a detective to work it out. The man wanted freedom. Marriage in those days meant for life. A handsome young man perhaps had a lot of choices and didn't want to limit himself to only one woman. In his writings, Kierkegaard uses this decision to tell the world that he sacrificed his love for a beautiful woman for the sake of faith. He didn't want to be a half-assed husband and commit sin. We know men can never be truly monogamous. But there could be another reason. It could be that he was influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy. Many writers, including Gustave Flaubert, never married nor had any children, saying the world was too cruel to bring another life to it. A masterpiece of Danish literature, Lucky Per, by the Nobel Prize-winning author Henrik Pontoppidan, published in 1904, fictionalized a similar scenario in which the male character suddenly breaks up with the woman of his dreams, citing he was not suitable to get married and retreats to the countryside where he lives a simple life. 2 million years ago, the Danish prince Hamlet asked the same question, to marry or not to marry. It has become a Danish tradition now that all Danish men ask themselves. Okay, joking aside, this decision had a profound influence on Kierkegaard's writing. Kierkegaard's journals of his thoughts and experiences detail his struggle with his life's purpose despite his religious faith. This was also partly because he lost both parents at a young age, but mainly due to his melancholic personality. While his parents died when he was in his 20s, they left him a handsome sum of money so he could live and travel around Europe somewhat comfortably, so he could focus on writing under different pseudonyms. While in Berlin in the 1840s, he attended lectures given by Schelling, the German idealist philosopher who was also a Romanticist poet. In the 18th century in Europe, Romanticism had created a wave. For example, Goethe's novel The Sorrows of Young Werther had a huge splash, and the literary movement of Sturm und Drang, literally meaning storm and stress, was about passionate first love. But Kierkegaard, who had rejected love and marriage a few years earlier, saw these Germans as either a bit too ungodly or a bit too rationally objective, or a bit too focused on the love between the sexes. So he started writing like crazy. As an outsider, he saw German philosophy with a fresh perspective, his own subjective experience of how to live. This is the birth of existentialism. In 1843, he published 3 books trying to tell people that hedonistic love is not worth it. He published Either Or, considered his magnum opus, under the pseudonym of Victor Eremite, in which he outlines philosophical views on 2 distinctive life choices, whether to pursue love through a hedonistic lens or live a moral life by taking responsibility. In other words, whether to pursue what gives you pleasures in life or do something bigger that is appreciated by society as a whole. Just remember that in the preceding decades, Romanticism encouraged men and women to pursue their inner desires through the works of poets such as Lord Byron, who left England for some freedom in Europe. In the same year, he published 2 more books, of which Fear and Trembling, under the name Johannes di Silentio, is the more well-known. In it, he further talks about choices we make in life, more specifically sacrifices one's personal romantic pursuit for his religious conviction. This refers to Kierkegaard's own breakup with Regine Olsen, stating that his anxiety made him not marriage material. Kierkegaard also wrote Repetition, which was published in the same year, detailing how love hides many religious sins. I should point out that Kierkegaard was 30 years old at the time, so many people were curious as to why the wealthy Dane wasn't married. This is the 19th century, so single men of that age who were not walking around with a family and wife were seen as a bit strange, except if you're playboys like Lord Byron type. But Kierkegaard was a man born in a churchyard. So by writing these books, he was deflecting the whole question on the outside and convincing himself on the inside that he was a man of God. If 1843 was the year of rejecting romance, 1844 was the year of finding God. Kierkegaard published several books titled 1, 2, 3, and 4, Upbuilding Discourses on the Existence of God. This was partly in response to the debate that was raging in Europe, particularly after the 1841 publication of the Ludwig Feuerbach's influential book, Essence of Christianity, in which the German anthropologist argued that God didn't create humans, but quite the opposite, humans created God. As I discussed before, this had a profound influence on Nietzsche, who abandoned God altogether. But Kierkegaard, being the guardian of religion and churchyard, wanted to prove otherwise. While the debate on the existence of God centered more on the sociological aspect of religion and how it glued a society together, positively or negatively, Kierkegaard moved the debate inside the individual person. He argued it was up to the individual to find God within him. This makes sense because science of anthropology had questioned the historical existence of God. In other words, there were no concrete records of any concrete God ever existing, except the accounts of humans. So Kierkegaard was clever and moved the debate inside the individual. God cannot be found on the outside through the rational scientific method, but it can be found inside the individual. But why did Kierkegaard make everything about the individual? It was simple. At the time, Hegel was the biggest dude in philosophy, so he said that we are the product of history, and history is only moving forward in a progressive way, ultimately landing us in a future perfectionist utopia. So Kierkegaard took a Hegelian view of us being the product of history, that each generation without a particular historical epoch is different, therefore can define their own views, and each individual should have a new beginning from his or her own birth. So we shouldn't be burdened with the views of previous or future generations. In other words, you are here and now, and it's up to you to define your religious convictions. This microscopic philosophy of the individual agents make Kierkegaard the father of existentialism, because he put the responsibility of one's faith or life in general onto that person himself or herself. They shouldn't follow the previous generations, nor should they worry about future generations, solely focusing on their own lives. But here's the irony though, it was his father's inheritance, the previous generation, so to speak, that allowed him to continue writing and publishing. This financial freedom allowed him to write what he wanted, not what his audience wanted. Thanks to his family inheritance, he didn't have to worry whether people read his books or not. It turned out the sales were pretty bad. People were frustrated with his style of indirect communication, which goes very contrary to the Nordic direct speech. In Scandinavia, you say what you mean and mean what you say. Kierkegaard used pseudonyms and referred to people with obscure references. For instance, he would call a religious person as the knight of hidden inwardness. It makes you laugh, doesn't it? His style of writing matched his own personality. Kierkegaard was an indecisive person, not a total flip-flop, but close to it. His marriage proposal and sudden breakup is a good example of an indecisive man. In many ways, he was similar to the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, who also employed heteronyms who were often in fierce debate among themselves. I think we have all been there. We often find our own views are challenged inside us, either through the cognitive dissonance or utter confusion. So Kierkegaard embodies that confusion we all experience. Modernity has done everything to make things certain, predictable, and reliable on the outside. From timekeeping, trains, supermarkets, and everything in between. However, when it comes to our own thoughts and convictions, we have become less decisive. So today, more than ever, we experience analysis paralysis because we have too many choices. So what goes inside the individual being is anything but certain. In his writings too, he employed 13 different pseudonyms and indirect references and in some cases incoherent arguments which caused confusion. I think he was worried about the backlash from the church, as he was quite against church telling people about God or holding a monopoly on God and religious faith. Instead, Kierkegaard wanted to free God and religion from the grip of the established church. Just like Leo Tolstoy, who considered himself an anarchist Christian, putting faith as an individual journey rather than a church communion. Kierkegaard thought the church was treating the congregations as children or herds and spoon-feeding them about God and religion. In the English language, the word flock is sometimes used for a church congregation as well as a group of animals such as sheep or birds. So Kierkegaard wanted each individual to take responsibility in finding God within themselves, not in a church. Later in life, he made direct attacks at the Danish church, arguing that his earlier writings were mere preps in his attempt to make religion the responsibility of the individual. His imprecise language shows Kierkegaard was unsure himself. In some ways, his books are like thinking loud for everyone to hear. He's not fully sure, but he keeps thinking aloud. In fact, inadvertently or on purpose, his writing displays the confusion of a modern man about God and the meaning of life. A society may have a clear purpose, but some of the individuals within that society is often lost. So Kierkegaard's existentialism is squarely focused on the individual, not the crowd or congregation. Kierkegaard continued to write about religion and the modern man. He was responding to divergent movements at the time. On the one hand, Hegel's theory of history put reason at the forefront of human progress, while Schelling and Goethe, on the other hand, championed a more romantic view of nature as dark and passionate force, which manifests itself in the philosophy of Schopenhauer as the blind will that pushes us without us knowing. Kierkegaard sat on the side witnessing Hegel's progressive philosophy championing human rationality, while in literature the Romantics fought against the human reason for the sake of passionate nature. For Kierkegaard, the modern individual is often forced to make a choice between reason, passion, and faith. He instead argues that the individual should take responsibility for their choices, but also have a leap of faith when it comes to God. While modernity emphasizes individual freedom when it comes to job, spouse, and so forth, there is another freedom. It is having faith in a divine power. Having such faith liberates one immensely. A good analogy would be visiting a doctor. You either trust the doctor's ability and skill to diagnose your illness, or you're skeptical, so you'd visit other doctors until you're fully satisfied. In the first case, you leave your faith to the doctor, which eases the burden on yourself. But in the second case, your cynical stance would make you more anxious. This anxiety stems from your ability to choose. That's what modernity has done to us. It has given us the choice, but our psychology is not ready for it. So Kierkegaard's ultimate answer is a leap of faith in which we go through a period of doubt and finally arrive at God, who we relinquish our power to. This became his ultimate answer for the modern freedom-led anxiety. Kierkegaard died in 1855 after collapsing on the street of Copenhagen. He was 42 years old, which is incredible given how much he wrote and how profound his ideas became later on. His writings had an immediate impact on the Danish church, which quickly enacted changes such as allowing church members to attend other churches instead of being bound to one parish. Baptism of babies became voluntary. He also influenced the Swedish literary giant August Strindberg, whose novel The Red Room I discussed here. As I mentioned before, Henrik Pontoppidan, the Nobel Prize-winning author from Denmark, was also influenced by Kierkegaard. So now the question is, how did he manage to be the first existentialist philosopher? The dominant philosophy at the time saw the individual within a social, religious, or historical framework. George Hegel was the dominant thinker who at the time saw history as the unstoppable force that molded society. Arthur Schopenhauer placed the blame on the blind will, somewhat similar to the force of evolutionary biology, such as instinct, that drives our choices. But Kierkegaard shifted the attention to the individual, their choices, and the consequence of those choices. Now the question is, why or how did he do it? The answer is pretty simple. He approached philosophy from a literary perspective. In literature, we generally do not blame social or historical forces for the choices the heroes and the villains make. That would make a boring story, but it's more exciting when we pay attention on how each individual make decisions. We put the responsibility on the individual characters. Kierkegaard started from this premise that each individual is free to make choices in life and they have to live with the consequence of those choices. As terrifying as it may sound, we have the responsibility to make choices in life, and this freedom gives us immense anxiety. Imagine Shakespeare's Hamlet holding the skull of dead Yorick and asking himself the most frightening question in literature, to be or not to be. Kierkegaard's philosophy can be boiled down to this fundamental question, to do or not to do. We all have a choice. As a result, Kierkegaard revolutionized philosophy but also had a huge influence on psychology as well as art and literature. Kierkegaard's style is also a break from the mainstream philosophy as he was drawn to literary metaphors, irony, and storytelling in his writings. In his early writings, he used pseudonyms partly to put himself at different shoes, i.e., fictional characters, and partly because he wanted to distance himself from his religious conviction, so he could see things more objectively. You could say he was employing a fiction writing style into philosophical and religious books in order to see things from various characters' points of view. He moved between the subjective and the objective and concluded that neither pure subjective nor pure objective view is complete. In other words, we cannot know the truth through our subjective experience, nor purely through observation of the external world. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Also, he refused to marry the woman he loved. So Kierkegaard was a genius who responded to mainstream philosophy from his own perspective, using an innovative literary style to put his philosophical ideas forward. This became a very popular style in the 19th century and the 20th century. Philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, etc. used the literary style to make philosophy more palatable for the ordinary people. Incidentally, these men are all existentialist philosophers. So Kierkegaard made philosophy centered on the individual, but also democratized philosophy so everyone could enjoy philosophical writings. In other words, he founded existentialism by looking at philosophy through the lens of literature, which focuses not on society, but on the individual characters. So existentialism as a philosophical approach has a huge debt to literature. Either Or is considered Søren Kierkegaard's most important philosophical work. Published in 1843 under the pseudonym of Victor Eremita, which in Latin means victorious hermit. Kierkegaard wrote the book while on a visit to Germany, where he got to know some of the key philosophical and artistic figures of the time. In the book, Kierkegaard responds to two German giants, Immanuel Kant and George Hegel. He saw Kantian philosophy a bit too rigidly rational that leaves little or no space for the individual to define himself. Kant's universalistic philosophy lacked a bit of individuality. The same is true about Hegel's historical philosophy, that we are by and large shaped by history or dialectical process, which can seem quite deterministic, which later became the basis of Marx's historical determinism. So both Kant and Hegel left little or no room for the individual to define himself or herself. So Kierkegaard took things from an individualistic point of view and thus considered the father of existentialism, that our life's purpose is not predetermined and it's up to us to define it for ourselves. In other words, we all have choices to make in life that ultimately decides the path we walk on. In this book, Kierkegaard goes to the heart of existence and asks this simple question: what is the purpose of it all? He sees two often contradictory answers. On the one hand, we live to have fun and enjoy pleasures life offers, including artistic beauty. But on the other hand, the other purpose of life is to live ethically and be a good person. So the choice we have is either to indulge in pleasures for ourselves or be good to others. While it's impossible to balance the two, however, in reality, one always takes over. Living a hedonist life of indulgence, be it sex, shopping, alcohol, etc., is often the easier option, as the human animal desires those things without effort. And even an aesthetic life of enjoying beauty is given to us by nature, while living an ethical life needs a lot of discipline and commitment. So Kierkegaard asks which gives the ultimate fulfillment in life, what comes easy and what comes hard. The two lifestyles are written by two separate fictional authors. The hedonistic artistic life is narrated through literary devices such as metaphors, lyrical, prose, and is full of imagery. This makes Kierkegaard very unique in Western philosophy, as he uses literary writing in his philosophical books, which are supposed to be purely academic and objective. Another philosopher famous for his literary writing is, of course, the German giant Friedrich Nietzsche, who combined poetry, lyricism, even fictionalized situations in order to put forward his philosophical ideas. He was similar to Dostoevsky, as both put forward their philosophical ideas through storytelling, and both were deeply psychological in their writings. So, while presenting an aesthetic lifestyle, Kierkegaard talks about art forms such as music, theater, free love, beauty in general. However, in the moral lifestyle section, Kierkegaard writes letters discussing social moral responsibility, self-reflection, and most importantly, love within a marriage. The writing style reflects the fact that an aesthetic lifestyle is based on self-expression of inner desires, while the moral life is in the form of letter, as though someone wiser giving you wisdom about the bigger picture. So the artistic lifestyle is somewhat similar to the romanticists such as Lord Byron, who traveled the world and slept with women without the commitment of a marriage, while in an ethical life a man commits to one woman. It's important to note that Kierkegaard was deeply conflicted about marriage and monogamy, because naturally and biologically men are more prone to polygamy than women are. So he refused to get married to the woman he loved, perhaps simply because he couldn't see himself being with one woman for the rest of his life. So for him, the ethical thing was not to marry at all. Once you marry, you're morally obliged to be monogamous and loyal to one person. So a pure aesthetic lifestyle, the pursuit of pleasure, will leave you empty at the end. Also, seeking pleasure is never enough, as you have to get higher to experience the high you experienced before. No matter how many women you seduce and sleep with, the urge never stops. This is depicted in Oscar Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, that ends in the destruction of everyone involved. For instance, someone taking drugs often move up the ladder and cranks it up a notch because the same stimuli gets dull over usage. As Schopenhauer pointed out, quote, life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. So Kierkegaard says the pendulum is always true between pleasure and boredom. You don't want to eat your favorite food forever, as you get bored of it soon enough. Here's what Kierkegaard says about boredom. Quote, boredom rests upon the nothing that interlaces existence. Its dizziness is infinite, like that which comes from looking into a bottomless abyss. So the natural answer to the emptiness of a pleasure-seeking lifestyle is to become rational and moral man. While you can enjoy worldly pleasures, but in moderation, and most crucially, you're responsible for the other too. Kierkegaard makes 2 points about reducing anxiety of modern life. One is comparison. The reason we experience anxiety is often we compare ourselves to those around us. We compare our looks, our success, our achievements, and things we own and things we do not own. This puts us in competition with everyone else. No matter what we achieve, it eats us from inside. The second point he makes is that wishing for something is also dangerous. Why? Because we expect something in the future. So while comparing us to others is about the past achievements or the present, and wishing is about the future. We wish because we lack something. So this creates expectations, and we all know what happens when you expect things. The natural outcome is often disappointing, as Proust showed in his masterpiece In Search of Lost Time, that the more one expects certain outcomes, the more painful is the disappointment when it doesn't come as you expected. This causes anxiety. Kierkegaard says, we live forwards, but we understand backwards. Kierkegaard also makes a distinction between the moral life being more objective, which forces us to think about others, while the aesthetic lifestyle is more subjective, as it's driven by pleasures for me. The real question he asks is this: are we supposed to enjoy life for ourselves or be concerned with the plight of others? Today, I would say most people, including myself, is far more concerned with their own well-being or pleasures than helping those who need help. Today, we have deferred the moral authority to the state, civil society, and social institution to help others, and we are mostly responsible for our own individual happiness. We see things on the news, but we rarely put ourselves in discomfort to do something about the challenges of the world. So Kierkegaard argues that a subjective, hedonistic lifestyle is when you live for yourself, and the objective moral lifestyle is when you live for others. Kierkegaard sees a problem with both if one goes to the extreme. For instance, in an aesthetic lifestyle, an artist is capable of creating a sublime piece of music or art, but an extreme self-indulgence can also destroy you. Throughout history, there are numerous examples of artists who had psychologically troubled lives. A good example is the drug use among the musicians in the past 50 years. While they were busy creating sublime music, in private they were numbing the pain through drugs and alcohol. And the moral lifestyle too, an extreme moral man can also become blind in his pursuit of correcting the world to the detriment of others. While most wars in the history have been fought for political or economic reasons, but there are also some wars that were fought for the sake of moral or religious principles. Kierkegaard is hesitant to offer a real solution to our existential question, because he says one must ask the question and find an answer himself or herself. Having said that, he does offer religious faith as an alternative to both aesthetic and moral lifestyle. He argues that faith allows us self-reflection, which opens your eyes to what's going on inside us, and only then we can truly understand the world. In other words, we must find an answer that is unique to us. This makes Kierkegaard unique, as he puts the responsibility of existential meaning onto us, not other people or leader or the past or religion. It is up to each one of us to find an answer that satisfies us from within. Kierkegaard, being a Nordic man, grew up in the part of the world that is incredibly cold and hostile. So naturally, people must think long-term instead of short-term indulgences. No wonder the Nordic countries were some of the first to embrace technology, rational thinking, and practical solutions to life's problems. Do you know what else? Capitalism took a firmer root in the north of Europe because people had to be pragmatic given the cold climate. Today, the Nordic countries are some of the richest in the world precisely because they prioritized for a cold winter rather than lying on a hammock and drinking beer. So Kierkegaard sees a pleasure-seeking lifestyle is mostly about now and here. That's why the Romanticists such as Lord Byron and Shelley left England and settled in the warmer parts of Europe like Italy or Greece. Even the word Romanticism hints to Rome, which is way warmer and climatically pleasant than Copenhagen, where Kierkegaard was born. So harsh winters make you think long-term rather than immediate gratification. Today, most of the world lives in such a comfort that we all prioritize immediate gratification more than restraint and discipline. Commitment is seen as necessary today. So for Kierkegaard, thinking long-term and commitment distinguishes an ethical person from a pleasure-seeking person. So life has presented as a choice, and it's totally up to us how we plan and execute it. Another way to analyze the book is the struggle of a religious, mainly a Christian man, to reconcile his natural urges with his religious discipline. Christianity, most religions in general, put a strong barrier around us in order to tame our natural animalistic tendencies of seeking pleasures and avoiding pain. While most religions tell you not to have sex until you get married, our natural urge doesn't care about religious morality. Our innate sexual urge pushes us non-stop to seek sexual partner to procreate with. Kierkegaard was about 30 when he wrote the book, so he knew what was happening in his pants, while his Christian upbringing pushing him to curb his enthusiasm until he was married. Marriage is serious commitment, and most men would avoid if they can get away with it and still have a partner, unless they find someone who is so beautiful that the only way to lock her down is through marriage. For a Christian man, once you're married, you're no longer free. Kierkegaard gives the authority to God to rescue him from his terrible predicament, stuck between nature's urge to spread the seed and social and moral responsibility of being with one woman. Kierkegaard's fiancée Regine Olsen wanted to get commitment from Kierkegaard, and he refused it. Today, a lot of men commit, but they have secret affairs. But Soren Kierkegaard chose not to get married at all. He was honest and chose a moral path. I think we are all stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to pleasure-seeking life or a moral life. While Kierkegaard puts hedonism and artistic creativity into the aesthetic lifestyle, today there is a clear distinction between the two. Pursuing artistic beauty is no longer seen as simple pursuit of pleasure or self-indulgence. Artists, novelists, musicians, and craftspeople pursue beauty through creativity, which is not only morally acceptable, but is also highly respected. Great artists have become almost godlike. But the problem is that these artists are a small minority of people. Nietzsche, who came a few decades later, understood this fact, so he based his philosophy on the minority of artists and philosophers, who he thought shouldn't be tamed by morality and social conventions. So Kierkegaard and either or simply breaks down the choices we all have. We can choose to be self-indulgent, but also be content with the consequences. We also have the choice to be morally responsible. In the 1840s, this was an incredibly novel idea that individuals had the choice in life. Today, we take it for granted, thanks to philosophers like Kierkegaard, who challenge authorities like church to allow us freedom to make choices for ourselves. Published in the same year as Either Or in 1843, Fear and Trembling was also written under a pseudonym Johannes di Silentio or John the Silent. In this book, Kierkegaard formulated his main philosophical idea that anxiety stems from our freedom of choice. When faced with the prospect of marriage to Regine, Kierkegaard had to make choice between commitment to monogamy, which comes with responsibility, versus freedom to do other things. He chose freedom, but on a deeper level, as humans, we are stuck between the past memories and experiences and future hopes and expectations. This is particularly true of a religious man who wants to end up in heaven, so his preoccupation is not to ruin his future or afterlife by messing things up in here and now. Kierkegaard starts off by arguing that each individual is different in how we perceive reality. Two people seeing the same thing might come to two different conclusions. The Buddhist fable of the blind man and an elephant is a good analogy. Each blind man touches different parts of the elephant's body and comes to separate conclusions when it comes to describing the animal. Now the elephant is the same thing, yet the observer is different, so the difference doesn't come from outside but from within. So Kierkegaard places his philosophy on the individuality and uniqueness of each person. This was revolutionary because philosophy up until him considered all humans through an essentialist perspective that we're all more or less the same, or pre-assembled with the same purpose. Kierkegaard as an existentialist philosopher questioned that existence comes first, and then we discover our true essence or purpose or unique self. Now, speaking of finding your true purpose and unique self, do you know where's the best place to learn new skill and hone your craft, so to showcase your talent and creativity? Let me introduce you to Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of online classes where you can get inspired, learn new skills, and put them to work in impactful ways. So let 2023 be the perfect time for you to learn a new creative hobby, land a new career, and launch your business. I always wanted to be more productive on YouTube, so I took this YouTube success course by Marques Brownlee, one of the most successful YouTubers. I was able to learn to plan my videos, research the topics, write a script, and produce the video. Now you have an amazing opportunity to try out Skillshare for 30 days for absolutely free to test it out. The first 1,000 people to use the link down below will get a month free trial of Skillshare. Also, by clicking the link below and joining Skillshare, you make it possible for me to make more quality videos. Now back to the video. How do we find our unique self? For Kierkegaard, religious fables play an important role. He references Abraham, the Jewish prophet whom God asked to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. This is perhaps the most difficult choice a person can make. Kierkegaard had a similar dilemma whether to marry Regine or not to marry, in similar vein to Hamlet, to be or not to be. It is through our freedom to make choices that our unique self emerges. This is the first step in the philosophy of existentialism. For Kierkegaard, we all have to make choices in life. You wake up in the morning, you can either go back to bed or go to work. The food you eat, the people you make friends with, the books you read, the videos you watch. But the biggest choices we make is often between our own happiness and duty towards others. And Anna Karenina Tolstoy poses this very same question to Anna, who abandons her husband and son in pursuit of her own happiness. The outcome is tragic for her and everyone around her. For Kierkegaard, we are all free to submit to authorities. For instance, we have the choice to listen to God or disobey Him, get married or not, love someone or not, take responsibility or not. There is no quick fix. It's only we can make decisions, and once we make the decision, we have to live by them. In other words, this state of being is essentially paradoxical that causes us fear and trembling. Freedom comes with responsibility, which is the opposite of freedom. Choices come with consequences, good and bad, which are the opposites of choices. In other words, our nature pushes us in one direction, but our moral duty into another direction. As Nietzsche said, quote, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous crossing and dangerous wayfaring, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous trembling and halting. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal." Another paradox is between moral transparency and natural concealment. Nature is full of stealth, camouflage, and deception. Predators must deceive to eat and survive. The same can be true among humans. The most successful people tend to be the smartest, who is able to conceal their true intention. Yet social morality puts a massive emphasis on honesty as being the best policy. Transparency is an attempt to prevent tragic events, while in nature, tragedy is an inherent aspect of life. Kierkegaard gives examples from the Greek tragedies in which characters often kill their own loved ones, simply because they didn't know them clearly. A son killing his father, or a father killing his own son without being aware of their true identity. One of the most heartbreaking tales in the Persian epic of Shahnameh is precisely this. The hero Rostam, without knowing, kills his own son. In other words, in the real world or in nature, you commit the act before asking questions. If Rostam didn't kill his son, he might have been killed himself. In other words, in order to achieve a goal, one must conceal. The same is true of Abraham, who concealed his true intention when he brought Isaac to the mountain to sacrifice him. The boy might have refused, or the whole society might have outraged and stopped him. He would not have been able to achieve his goal of obeying God. This nobody can fully grasp and understand, except Abraham himself. Kierkegaard argues that when we face a tough decision, it's hard for others to fully understand what goes on inside the person. Abraham holding his young son, or Hamlet holding the human skull, are the only ones who truly understand the choices they make. Making choices is synonymous with having the authority to make such choice. But with authority comes responsibility. Kierkegaard goes a step further, saying that it is hard to explain such choices or dilemmas through rationality. It's only possible to explain those situations through faith. What is faith? It's a kind of resignation or deferring authority to God. Faith is almost like love, because both love and faith throws reason almost out of the window. They're a bit blind, but for Kierkegaard, faith is not without doubt. Doubt is part of the baggage. Quote, doubt is conquered by faith, just as it is faith which has brought doubt into the world. Now here, later existentialist philosophers saw a hole in Kierkegaard's philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche removed God from existentialism and made it purely an artistic pursuit. Jean-Paul Sartre also saw a problem with Kierkegaard's allusion to Abraham's tale, saying that first of all, the man should have been more cynical of the angel, and also should have questioned his true intention. Sartre's existentialism, which I have discussed here, removed God and faith and replaced it with nothingness or emptiness of life, which gives us the opportunity to build our own self from scratch. Knut Hamsun, the Norwegian genius novelist, has a different take. He argues that Kierkegaard wasn't talking about daily choices we make, but the principle that underlines those choices. In other words, we follow certain values, and our daily choices are, to some extent, determined by the underlying principal values. For example, some religious people refrain from certain activities like sex before marriage, while atheists do not hesitate to indulge in such activities. Why? Because they follow different value systems. The solution to modern despair and anxiety, according to Kierkegaard, is truly personal. One has to find a unique path for himself or herself to feel fulfilled. There is no blueprint one can follow and find happiness. The only blueprint Kierkegaard offers is this: you alone are responsible to find meaning for your own life. Quote, a crowd is indeed made up of single individuals. It must therefore be in everyone's power to become what he is, a single individual. No one is prevented from being a single individual. No one, unless he prevents himself by becoming many. Thank you for watching.